Something is killing the Sockeye salmon of British Columbia's Fraser River before they ever reach the gravel where they were born, and for years no one could say what. They are not caught, not eaten, not poisoned, they are simply dying within sight of home, and whatever is doing it leaves no bite, no predator, no body you can point a finger at. Picture a fish that has crossed 1,000 kilometers of open Pacific, fattened for years at sea, and turned back toward the exact stream it hatched in to spawn once and die. In 2009, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans expected about 10 million of them to come home to the Fraser. Around 1.5 million showed up, roughly 1 fish in 7. It was the worst return anyone had ever recorded, and it was catastrophic enough that the federal government stood up a 2-year judicial inquiry, $37 million, the Cohen Commission, for the sole purpose of answering one question: what happened to the fish? If you're fascinated by animals the way I am, subscribe so you don't miss what's really happening out there. And here is the detail that broke every simple theory before it started. The very next year, 2010, that same river produced one of the largest sockeye runs in a century, around 30 million fish, so many the boats couldn't keep up. So whatever emptied the river in 2009 did not simply kill the run. It comes and goes. One year it takes almost everything, and the next it takes almost nothing, and that on-off pattern is the real signature, a killer that only shows up in certain years, under certain conditions, and then vanishes as if it had never been there. So they went looking for a culprit, and there was an obvious one waiting. Strung along the Sockeye's migration route through the Discovery Islands sit open net pens full of farmed Atlantic salmon. Hundreds of thousands of penned fish parked directly in the path the wild sockeye have to swim. Packed cages breed parasites, sea lice, viruses, bacteria, an epidemic incubator anchored in a narrow channel, and every summer the entire wild run threads past it in dense, exhausted schools. It was a clean, satisfying answer: the farms are poisoning the migration. It was persuasive enough that the Cohen Commission recommended the Discovery Islands farms be removed by September of 2020 unless the government could prove they posed only minimal risk to the wild fish. That deadline came. The government did not close them. 9 internal DFO risk assessments were used to call the danger minimal, and the pens stayed in the water. Then, months later, the same government reversed itself and ordered those farms phased out by the middle of 2022 anyway, amid lawsuits and political fighting that hasn't fully settled to this day. Which tells you something uncomfortable: the most wanted suspect in this case was never actually convicted. It was never quite cleared, either it was simply not established, because the science kept refusing to close the door. The strongest scientific lead belonged to a DFO geneticist named Christy Miller Saunders. In 2011, she published something genuinely startling: sockeye carrying a particular genetic pattern, a kind of molecular fingerprint of a dying immune system, were roughly 13.5 times less likely to reach their spawning grounds than fish without it. A signature you could read in the blood that predicted, with brutal accuracy, which salmon were already doomed. And the press did exactly what you'd expect. They ran it as a smoking gun, a mystery virus, a plague loose in the Pacific. But watch what the scientist herself did with it. Under oath, at that same commission, Miller testified that a newly identified virus was a candidate, and that far more work was needed before anyone could call it infectious or lethal at all. She would not confirm the headline written in her name. And after 2 years and $37 million, the Commission's own final conclusion was the least satisfying sentence in the entire story: there was no single smoking gun. Not the farms. Not one virus. A long list of stresses stacked on top of each other, and no monster at the bottom of it. If you have your own theory about what's happening out there, I want to hear it. Leave it in the comments. Tell me what you'd have us dig into next. Because when the investigators finally cornered the most likely killer, it turned out to have no teeth, no venom, and no face. It's the water itself. Follow one of these fish up the Fraser, and you understand the trap it's in. A returning sockeye does not eat on the way home. It runs on a fixed energy budget, everything it will ever spend, banked years earlier at sea. And it burns that budget, swimming hundreds of kilometers upstream against the current on a one-way ticket. That system was engineered by evolution for a specific river at a specific temperature. And the numbers on that are chillingly precise. At 18 degrees, a sockeye already swims measurably worse. At 19, its body shows clear physiological strain. At 20 and above, the stress turns severe and it starts showing up in the death counts. And somewhere around 21 degrees, for some populations, you hit a ceiling, a point past which the heart simply cannot pump blood fast enough to keep the fish moving. Cardiorespiratory collapse. No parasite, no infection, no predator. A heart that runs out of room to beat while its owner is still swimming as hard as it can. Now lay the trend on top of it. Fraser summer water has warmed by something like 1.5 to 2 degrees since the 1950s. That doesn't sound like much until you turn it into days. From the 50s through the 80s, this river crossed 19 degrees, the strain line, on average about 2 days a year. Over the past 8 years, that average has climbed to 22 days a year. The gauntlet these fish are built to run has quietly, repeatedly, gotten hotter than the one their biology was designed for, and in the hot years, the ones where the river sits above that line for weeks, the run doesn't come home. That is the on-off switch, not a virus that appears and disappears. A thermometer. And I want to be honest with you about where this actually stands, because this is a real river and a real, still open file, not a tidy mystery with a bow on it. Temperature is the best supported answer and the least dramatic one, and it still doesn't cleanly explain every bad year on its own. Miller's genetic signature is still an active question. Diffo's own project on it is titled, without irony, The Mystery of the Fraser River Sockeye. The farms were never truly acquitted. Nobody has closed this the way a simple case gets closed. What's not in doubt is what's on the table. The Fraser feeds one of the largest sockeye systems on Earth. British Columbia's biggest salmon fishery, and generations of First Nations who have fished this river for food, for ceremony, and for trade since long before anyone forecast a run or convened a commission. It is not an abstraction, it is the spine of an entire coast. So the terrifying thing turned out to be a number on a chart, climbing. A river slowly heating past the one temperature its most important fish cannot survive, killing them in plain sight, in the shallows, in view of the gravel they were trying to reach. This is one case out of many. Subscribe to see our next video. It's even deadlier than this one.